say something?
1, 2.
Again?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, wait.
Okay.
Takes a second, and then you're live.
One, two, three, four, five.
Can you try that again?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hello, hello.
Est-ce que t'entends? No?
Oh.
Okay, you just... that
Okay.
works. All right.
Test.
Okay, now it should be on.
Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2.
Can you hold this for me? I'll just bring the volume up a little bit.
Okay. Do you have your questions written?
No.
Oh, okay. Usually my publicist sends a list of vetted questions out to people.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they sent it.
All right, I think now that works.
Okay.
You can close it up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
whenever you're ready, just...
We're good? All right. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir. Annie. I'm Leslie Weir. I'm the Librarian and Archivist of Canada. Bienvenue dans notre salle Alfred Pellin. Bibliothèque et Archives Canada est fière de s'associer une fois de plus au Festival international des écrivains d'Ottawa pour présenter cet événement et célébrer le pouvoir de la culture. We are gathered here together this evening on the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who have inhabited and cared for these lands since time immemorial. Let us join together to show our gratitude and respect to them and to the land for all that it provides us, the trees that give shade, the water and food that sustains us, and the paths that connect us. As a national institution that's part of the federal government, we embrace the responsibility to help ensure that the next generations of land stewards are respectful and grateful for the bounty of this land upon which we live, work, and play. Libraries and Archives Canada remains committed to to making meaningful contributions to the calls of action issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. With the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation taking place this weekend, it seems so appropriate to reflect on why reconciliation is so important and so necessary. And of course, without truth, there can be no reconciliation. And I think tonight is to talk about truths. Indigenous women have suffered in so many ways from the beginning of colonialism. These harms include discrimination, degradation, violence, and even the ultimate price of death. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the two-spirited LGBTQI+ people of Canada was brought to light to the general public through the work of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Significant actions have been taken through the implementation of the National Action Plan and the federal pathway, but there is still so much more to be done, and we still have so much more to learn. One of the ways that we can better understand the full story of our past is by listening to the Indigenous voices. There are so many stories to tell, ones that we did not necessarily want to hear in the past. But thankfully, I think times are changing. This evening, we have the immense privilege of greeting Angela Sterritt from the Gitxsan award-winning CBC reporter, author, and for many of us, superwoman, to celebrate the launch of her debut memoir. Unbroken, My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls presents us with a fascinating web of stories, joining Angela's life experience as a teenager on the streets with a moving investigation. This investigation brings to light stories of women who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time in a world that did not want to see or hear about their struggles. Unbroken tells stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women, systematic racism and abuse, but also strength and hope. So I would like to thank you, Angela, for your perseverance. If I may say, we seek inspiration from your prose. We'd like to thank you for all the ripples you have made, which carry us through the wave of change that we are currently experiencing. J'aimerais vous dire que Bibliothèque et Archives Canada a toujours été une organisation parfaite. Mais, et là, c'est pas de tout le cas. Les documents préservés dans notre vault reflètent les nombreux préjugés de leur époque. Cependant, nous redoublons d'adieux pour que les voix de tous les membres de notre société soient étendues. In closing, I think it's really important to note that Angela has mentioned the dreadful power of erasure, which weighs on the shoulders of so many Indigenous people. Angela, this evening, everyone who's here is here to hear your voice. And in fact, I think they'd like to hear your voice on almost any day. We can keep learning about the truths of our past and understand how we can forge a better future for everyone. And I am so looking forward to your conversation with journalist and podcaster Erica Eiffel. Without further ado, but just before, I just want to say, Sean, what a great lineup. I am blown away. I've got plans going forward for the next, till December 7th. Anyway, pretty exciting times. I'd like to invite my dear colleague, artistic director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival, Sean, to the podium. Bonne soirée à tous.
Thank you, Leslie. All I'm here to do is to thank you for being here, remind you that the festival is coming up soon. And at the back of this room, there is Jim is sitting there. Jim represents a local bookstore. Imagine such a thing exists. There are 4 local bookstores in Ottawa. They need our support. They pay taxes. They pay a living wage. They are hubs of the community. So I'm here just to beg you, When you are buying books, when you are buying 5, 6, 7, or 8 copies of Angela's book, do it from an independent bookseller, not from Jeff Bezos. He's taken your money to space. Jim spends it right here in Ottawa. So that's my pitch on that. And what an honor to have these two amazing people on our stage this evening. Let's just give a warm welcome to Angela and Erica.
Can you hear me? There we go. We were laughing before because I underestimated the shortness of my skirt. So I'm now looking very fancy with my coat up here.
So first of all, Angela, it is an honor to sit here with you. It's funny, like when I started podcasting because I felt silenced within institutions in this country, down the street. And the weight of these institutions is a weight that I know as a Black Canadian, I am very much conscious of every day. And so I am always looking for people who have pushed boundaries, who have done their part in a struggle that is multi-generational, that started way before our generation and will continue after that, and that we're all in a relay race rather than just like a marathon. So I wanted to say that first. So I wanted to say this book, Unbroken, first of all, this book really does center Indigenous women, which is something that I can't remember reading, ever. Even in history books, even in sometimes history books written by men, you do not hear about the contributions and the struggles and the cost that women pay for existing. And what I got is that to exist in a sort of settler colonial construct as an Indigenous woman is to be vulnerable all the time. And so, but that doesn't mean weak. It doesn't mean less than. And so what I got from this is a very compassionate telling and storytelling of the victims and their lives. And instead of you starting out, for example, with what they did, you would start talking about how they like to ride their bikes or the ATVs or something. So then in my head, I got an image of a girl. And I just wanted to say that because I think that's very important in terms of how we push storytelling forward. So I know that was a conscious decision on your part. So can you talk about the consciousness of that and maybe the weight of that you can tell that you took responsibility for and with?
Yeah, I wanted to start, I want to get to that question because I think that's super important in terms of the way we humanize Indigenous women in particular, the ways that we've been erased, and also the ways that our dignity has been shaped by media, by Canada, by settler society as a whole. But I wanted to kind of start out like setting the table just because it gives people a bit of an insight and kind of an announcement about where I'm at right now. So it's a bit of a story and it's funny. My honorary Gitxsan name is Lualgiatum Kapist. And so our culture, our Gitxsan culture is matrilineal. So that means that our recognition legally by our culture, by our people, flows through the mother's line. my dad is Gitxsan and my mom is white. And so as I started to take language classes with my elder, Chuis, who's also my cousin and our language teacher, I said, everyone's introducing themselves as accordance to their house and to their clan and to their community. What do I do? Because I don't have that yet. And she said, well, we'll give you an honorary Gitxsan name. And so this is about 7 months ago. So at the time I had decided I was quitting CBC, and I told my boss, and she was like, please don't go. I will do absolutely anything. And I said, no, it's okay. Like I'm definitely quitting, but I'll meet up for coffee with you for sure. We can go for coffee and I can tell you, you know, on a spiritual level why I've decided to quit. So as I'm going to meet my boss to quit my job, I get this email from Chuis, and she says, your honorary Gitxsan name is Luwalgia Dzumkbist, which means woman who works in television and radio. And the literal translation of it is woman who talks in a box. And so I'm like, okay, like this will just be funny. Like every time I hear it, I will laugh. Like that's the purpose of my name. Our names are not prophetic, they're literal. So a friend of mine lives on Vancouver Island, so she's a woman who lives on an island. So our names are not prophetic. So my boss actually lured me back in because she was like, I'll do anything. And I was like, I will only work with this person and do this and do that. She said, done, which shocked me. And so I did that for the last 7 months. And I think 3 days ago, I aired my last television story, online story, and radio story with CBC. So I'm no longer with CBC, and it's a celebratory thing. It's a very happy thing for me. I've closed that chapter, and we can get in to kind of the media as an institution.
I hope so.
Yeah, we can get to the juice. Yeah, so I've closed that chapter. But as of June 21st of this year, I was legally recognized in my house. My grandfather, Walter Sterritt, was groomed his whole childhood to be the hereditary chief of Wigak, the House of Big Wings. And he actually said no to it. That's a huge responsibility in our culture. In modern context, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of work. And he wanted to focus on work. He wanted to focus on his family. And so my uncle Neil took on the role. But as of June 21st of this year, I am legally Luwalgia Dzumkbist from the House of Wigak of the Wolf Clan, Lakibu of Gitnamax. So it's a big transition in my life to sit within that feeling of belonging. That's something that Canada ripped away from us, right, at the time of colonization, and continues to do so. And so I guess back to your question about showing or depicting, you know, that first few pages of my book is in memoriam. It lists hundreds of Indigenous women and girls and non-Indigenous women and girls as well who've lost their lives or who have disappeared from the Highway of Tears and the downtown east side. And people always ask why I did that, and it was because a lot of the women and girls have been not afforded dignity. They've not been, their names have been said wrong in the media because the media's gone by the RCMP.
You gave them their name back.
Their name, their nation,
Yeah.
their hobbies, who they are, how they passed away. And a lot of their nations were not listed in the media, right? It was just missing Indigenous women. And so I really hope through my book that people see Indigenous women and girls as those of having a community, a family who loved them, and a nation, a country that loves them as well.
You gave them space to exist.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I saw throughout the book. You gave women who were denied dignity in death a space to exist as a life. And I think that was very important, and that's what I got from this book, and I'd never seen that before. So, yes, let's start with, so first of all, your life is interspersed throughout this book, along with the memories of these women and telling their stories. And not only that, telling the stories about how they were consistently denied justice in life and in death and care and humanity. So in that sense, I think that is revolutionary. And how did you come to kind of use that kind of, I feel like it's an undulating crisscross of ribbons in a way. Each story crisscrosses another. And along this stretch of highway, which I then realized was Yellowhead.
No.
Oh, like it passes through
goes-
Edmonton.
connects.
Yeah, at
Right.
Yellowhead. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Sorry, I'm from Edmonton. So I was like, oh, and so I actually looked it up on Google Earth.
Okay.
Yeah, and I saw just this long stretch of highway. It goes from Prince George, and it basically traverses BC from the interior out to Prince Rupert. And so I want you to talk about what that highway means with these communities and with these women and so on and so forth, and that significance in their lives.
Yeah. I think the first few chapters in my book, or there's a few chapters in my book that talk about the Highway of Tears. So it's a stretch of highway from northwestern BC, so Prince Rupert to Prince George. It's a 700-kilometer stretch of highway. And Tamara Chipman went missing from there. Ramona Wilson went missing from there. And it's interesting that you were talking about women who were, maybe not seen by many. That's what you were saying at the beginning. And I just want to say, like, there's been so many Indigenous journalists who've come before me, but there's also been, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who've been speaking the truth for, more than 100 years. And their stories, in many cases, were just not published or not deemed worthy enough. I'm thinking about Lee Markle, right? So there's been many Indigenous authors and people and elders and survivors who've come before me who've been fighting for this truth to be shared long before I arrived on the scene. When I'm talking about the Highway of Tears, I think what you were getting there is, when I started writing this story, one of, I guess, my drives for the story was I kept on seeing, CBS 48 Hours or other authors, non-Indigenous authors, other TV shows, kind of painting this picture of the Highway of Tears, or even Indigenous women's lives as filled with darkness and despair and terror. And we do have a crisis in Canada, right? There's more than 1,200 or more missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in this country. That being said, when I started seeing the reports coming out about the Highway of Tears, I just thought, that's, it is a place where people have gone missing and been murdered. But when I'm driving along that highway, it's a place of deep and profound beauty. There's snow-capped mountains, there's rivers, there's ravens, there's eagles, there's sophisticated governing structures, there's beautiful people who are, who've lived there for thousands of years. And who fought, right? Like Gitxsan people have fought for our right to the land for many, many years, since the inception of colonization. And so it's always, I guess, this sort of balancing, right, of showing the beauty, but also not shying away from colonial violence that has set us here, and making sure that people know that colonial violence isn't a thing of the past, right? Sometimes I've interviewed people, and it's not just one generation, it's multi-generations that have attended residential school. Not only that, but we live in a society today where the federal government is continuing to fight Indigenous people in court over their land. The federal government owns 92% of the land in Canada, and the rest isn't even Indigenous owned, and is still going to court. That is a depiction of the reality that we are still in a process of colonization today, where Indigenous people are still being dispossessed of our lands, of our right to human security as Indigenous people, and our right to safety and dignity. And
Because you do start, I think, almost every chapter except maybe the last two, you do start off with this beautiful depiction of the land and what inhabits the land. And you said something about sockeye salmon, and I was thinking about sockeye salmon, and it just seems like it was almost like it seemed like a before times, like before colonialism, before all this stuff, and it's not. It is, and that's what kind of balances out the trauma of these stories and the difficulty in reading how these women died. And so, how did I was also reading it, I also saw that you yourself were searching for your own sense of self at first, and then your own purpose, and through that, journalism kind of came along with you, I feel, instead of you pursuing a career. And so how do you think that, in terms of the way journalism kind of came with you, kind of set you up to be able to tell these stories in the way that you did?
I wanted to touch on something you said about it seemed like before times. I wanted to tug on that thread just because I do think there is a narrative that we hear in Canada a lot that Indigenous people no longer exist. And in fact, I was in Quebec not long ago, probably 10 years ago, doing a film, and this guy said, I don't see any Indigenous people, like they've all been killed off. And I said, you're so close to Ganawage, like you're literally like 10 minutes away from Ganawage. Indigenous people are here. And I think I hear this question over and over again. I heard
People ask this, like with a straight face?
So a course that I taught last week, somebody said, well, where are they? And I said, I think you're wanting us to show up in buckskin on horses, you know, or performing some sort of ceremony for you, but we are lawyers, we are doctors, we are, you know, scholars, we are journalists, we are students, we are mechanics, we are here, but also many of us are still connected and still practicing our governing structures, are speaking our language, reclaiming our connections to community. And that is sort of really interesting to me, that people, I guess, you know, there's this narrative going on about residential school, like look at how much they've lost and how traumatized they are. And every Indigenous community I've ever visited, there's been a lot lost, of course, absolutely, how can you not? And that's something I touch on in my book as well, is there's residential school, but there was also the reserve system and a system of apartheid in Canada, where Indigenous people, family members, grandmothers, parents were at the same time being forced on reserves. You know, in some cases hundreds of miles away from their traditional territories, in unfertile land, away from the convenience that was being built in settler society. And so it's important for me to think about the things that have not been lost, or the things that we have recovered. When I went to Tsilhqot'in territory, for example, in Williams Lake, everyone there spoke their language. When I went to Nunavut, all the children were speaking Inuktitut fluently on television, right? When I was in Yellowknife, there was 9 Indigenous languages broadcasted on CBC. My community, the land has always been something so innately important to us. And within that paradigm, the importance of the feast hall, our governing structure, right? Which is, it's explicated in our totem poles. It's explicated in the sockeye salmon in the rivers, in the forests, in the leadership of our matriarchs, of our Somogiets and our Simgigets, our high chiefs and matriarchs. And so I think it's important for people to know that we're not just still here, we're still here with our languages, our cultures, our governing systems, and our strength and our will to teach Canadians about a better way to have a sustainable environment, of human connection, of the climate. And so I think it's really important to understand the narrative of erasure in a modern context, but also in a forward-thinking context.
Absolutely. So now, when you were in the downtown east side, and with your sketchbooks, and really just, you know, being young and not having, you know, the safety of others, right? It reminded me that journalism really is local. Like, you were talking about, actually this was in Prince George, you were talking about the stories of police there, of the Judge Ramsey, I believe, who went to jail for basically assaulting young Indigenous girls and having the power to do so. And when you were talking about there being rumors, and like you said, these stories have been around for decades and centuries and so on, it reminded me that journalism really sometimes does start with that. And it starts with people caring enough to listen. And so I guess, which is really interesting, because I know, like, I have and you have come up against a system that treats that as suspicious and treats that kind of knowledge of community as suspicious. And so how do you reconcile a white professional structure with what you feel that you were put on here to do, like your purpose, which is to tell those stories and to tell them in a way that's different? Like, how do you reconcile those two?
I mean, I think when I first started my career, there was definitely a push to oppress those voices, right? So I remember, I first started reporting, well, I was like a researcher in Prince George in 2004. And it was sort of like, oh yeah, like you're kind of the intern, like we'll let you do about, one Indigenous story a week or whatever. And when I went to, I might not say where I went to, but I started in TV, and it was at the time, 2010. And I remember pitching Indigenous stories and then being like, oh, like we already have, kind of our quota, so to speak, for the day or for the week. And it would be rare to see 2 Indigenous stories a day. It would be very difficult to tell Indigenous stories at all. Connie Walker, I think, just did some incredibly profound work when it came to pushing forward missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, not just as one story, but as a unit at the CBC, and making sure that those stories were amplified as stories, but also in the context of colonial violence. And so definitely, I think at the beginning it was sort of, I think you were maybe alluding to it there, but there's an eye of suspicion about Indigenous, people of color, and Black journalists telling our own stories. Keep in mind, some of the stories that I would be pitching would be thousands of kilometers away from my own Gitxsan nation, right? So there's, to start off, a homogenization that you're all sort of one people. But absolutely, at the beginning of my career, and maybe even the last couple of days, the last story that I was doing, 2023, I was being told, this is the way that you should do this story. This is the way that you should tell this story. And people always ask, well, what do you mean by that? So when you have a kind of like a colonial gaze on your stories, or on the way that you're telling your stories, it's sort of, for many years we couldn't use the word racism. For many years we couldn't talk about colonialism.
No.
You couldn't talk about the 60s scoop because people would say, well, no one really knows what that is. So then you're gonna have to kind of do this whole explainer of what it is, and now it'll take up the whole story. So we'd rather you not even talk about that. So for many years of my career, there was a push just to have Indigenous stories elevated at all, or told by an Indigenous person, because you're called bias. You're too close to the story, right? And I think one of the things that's very heartening for me, and I think it's important for people to hear change, how change is happening. When you open up cbc.ca or any news outlet, but I think particularly CBC, you'll see like tons of stories lining the website. On TV, more than 2 or 3 stories of Indigenous communities a night, right? And I think that shows us the importance. I think people always say, well, what changed? I think social media changed how we tell Indigenous stories. The metrics on our stories, when you're sitting in at a table, when you're having a pitch meeting in the morning, and there's 12 white people all around the table saying the most important story today is my kid can't get into the same swimming lesson slot as her sibling. And me saying, what? And everyone going, yeah, me too, that is definitely the top story today. And me saying, my community is fighting, like not even my community,
I've had
this community over here is fighting for safe drinking water.
Yeah.
And then saying, yeah, like I think that's important, but it's too complicated, or I don't think that's the top story. And me saying, okay. And I mean, for one, think about that sense of belonging that you get in an institution where you're constantly told your stories are not the top story, or they will never be. You go on social media and say, I think this story is the top story, or what do people think? Do people think this is an important story? And you have 50,000 people saying this is the most important story today. And then that story meeting going, oh my God, did you see Angela's tweet? People are talking about this. And then you publish the story, and we have metrics on a story, and you can see, 1 million people read this story. So the reflection of the media, right, isn't always who's inside, right? We're trying to tell stories of the people that you see on the street every day, but that's often not what you see inside the newsroom, right? That's still 70 to 80% white people, right? And that's not reflective of our society. And so I think it's important to note that things are changing. And we have a long way to go, especially when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
I find that there's more interest in younger generations, especially. The amount of just baseline knowledge that like Gen Z has, I'm actually impressed, like, because of social media, because they've been exposed, because you can go on TikTok and watch a 2-minute story about the history of whatever, of certain regions, certain people, certain whatever. And the fact that this content is coming from users themselves, from people themselves who are taking the time to do that, to me says a lot. And I don't think that I would exist without social media, and that our stories would even be told as much as they have been without social media. And so how important has that been in terms of curating your stories, let's say?
I mean, I think it's important for what I just talked about in terms of the metrics and in terms of people seeing that social media, what's going on in social media isn't necessarily what's going on in people's minds in newsrooms. But yeah, I think it's also become a really toxic place, not just on Twitter recently, but other platforms. I think it's just like society, right? It can become a mixed bag.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of, I have to say this. I was in Vancouver for the first time in December, and I was in the downtown east side. And the funny thing is, I was staying in the West End, like near Stanley Park in that area, and I felt like people knew I was Black. You know what I mean? Like dark-skinned Black, like I felt it there. And I go to the downtown east side, and it was the place where it wasn't really I can't explain it, but I felt like comfortable there because I saw there were communities, even though, you go to the downtown east side and they have all these tents and a lot of people around and milling around, but I saw a place that had a sense of I don't want to say responsibility, but like a community feel. And it was the only place in Vancouver that I found that, which I found really interesting. And so Gaston is not too far away. And the story of Gaston and his 12-year-old Indigenous wife and the erecting of his monument and his statue, who we choose to identify as heroes too matters. And I'm wondering how you go up against institutions that hold that dear. So, we could talk about Sir John A. or Gaston or others. I think there was a doctor named Furlong or something like that too. The point is, you have all of these people in positions of power who are able to get away with it, and to get away with the systematic abuse and systemic degradation of people. And I'm wondering if the many inquiries that have come about and that have led to changes, procedural changes with the police, with child welfare, and so on and so forth, have made as much of a difference as we're hoping that they would. Like, is that something that we're being naive about as a country, that our administrative prowess will get us out of this in some way or make things better?
I mean, I think I was asked not long ago about the National Inquiry in 2019. It came up with 231 calls for justice. And so at the beginning of this year, CBC did a report looking into how many of those calls to justice have been met. And I don't know if people want to take a wild guess about how many of those have been met. I like people's hands with the numbers. That's awesome. 5. I love how jaded this crowd is. That's why I left journalism, because it made me jaded. But so out of those 231 calls to justice, 2 have been met. And it's 2023, and I think people are, in many ways we can be a little bit delusional about where we are, how far along we are in terms of truth and reconciliation. And so this person on CBC asked me, what does that tell you? What does that say to you when the federal government or the public has only met 2 of these calls to justice? And I said, well, it sends a strong message out to the world, doesn't it? That we don't matter. And I think it's really interesting lately that I've been hearing a lot of people from other parts of the world really talking about Canada as shameful. I remember when I went to the United Nations in 2006, I took a break from journalism from 2005 to 2010 or 2009. And I went to the United Nations with a group called Justice for Girls to talk about the Highway of Tears and the number of Indigenous women and girls that were missing along the Highway of Tears. And also to talk about at the same time that girls, Indigenous girls in particular, and boys were being handcuffed when they went into the sweat lodge when they were in prison. So to kind of shame Canada, talk about it to an international audience about how wrong that was violating human rights, and it was also a form of torture. And because of our work, that they ended up stopping that. When I went to the international community and we were talking about this, I remember so many of the international experts saying, I'm in shock. We hear of Canada as the paradisimo of the world, with the best human rights track record, with the most resources, with the best environmental policies.
Who told them that?
And
I'm sorry.
I mean,
it's our marketing. Our marketing. Yes,
Stephen Harper is on record in Geneva saying that we don't have a history of colonization.
Yes,
right? That is on record.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to this one South African international expert, and he said, I feel like the man with no shoes who's met the man with no feet. When I was talking about Canada. And I think, we often talk about shame as a negative thing. And in our culture, it's about accountability. We actually have shaming feasts, and people who even spill someone's soup or disrespect another house group, that person's entire house group has to pay back the other house. And it's a form of accountability. It's a form of witnessing as a collective what you did wrong so that mistake will never be made again. And so I think where we're at today when it comes to truth and reconciliation, I think we're not even kind of there along with the truth, right? We're coming to terms with what happened in the past, but we're still not up to speed about what's happening today and why that's happening today, right? And in many regards, we're still in a strong process of colonization. when it comes to Indigenous people in this country.
Do you think that, I would assume that as long as we haven't talked about the Indian Act, but that is the strong piece of legislation that keeps, that decides where Indigenous people live, making them more susceptible to forest fires, for example. And you tied that into, the lack of transportation, which was very important. I always say transportation is a gendered issue too.
So I just want to back up. So you were talking about Indigenous people living on reserves or in communities, right? So I think there's a misconception about where Indigenous people in this country live, and that also ties into this this fabrication that we don't pay taxes, for example. So 0.2% of Canada is reserve land. Reserve land is not owned by Indigenous people, that is owned by the Crown. 82% of Indigenous people in this country live in the cities, right? And a lot more than that pay taxes, because I just had to like demystify that on Twitter the other day, and to an audience that I gave a speech to, because a lot of them thought Indigenous people don't pay taxes in 2023. And so what you were talking about there, about the highway of tears, the transportation system, and you're also talking about the Indian Act. It goes back to what I was talking about when I'm talking about the ways Indigenous people were forced on reserves, right? So many Indigenous people moved into the cities, right? Like I just said, 82% now. Back in the day when the federal government was making room for settlers and giving incentives to settlers to move to Indigenous territories and moving Indigenous people off to reserves, that was under the Indian Act. The Indian Act is a policy that we still live under today. It's the only race-based legislation in the world. But at the time, Indigenous people, I think I explained it already a little bit, forced on reserves. I had a guy call into a radio show that I was hosting, and he asked my producer to get through the line, and he was saying, well, why is it that it's all Indigenous women going missing and murdered? Why isn't it blonde cheerleaders? And he didn't get through to the line, but what I wanted to tell him was, for one, blonde cheerleaders, maybe not cheerleaders, but white people do go missing and are murdered from that stretch of highway. For two, there's several Indigenous nations that live along that highway that have been forced onto reserves. Again, many live in the cities, but back at the time when we weren't allowed, we needed a visa to leave the reserve. That's called the pass system, right? We were forced into infertile lands. We were not allowed to practice our traditional economies. We would go to jail if we hunted or we fished. We were not allowed to go into settler societies. So we were basically, it basically created this system of racialized poverty, right? But at the same time, what did it do in terms of marginalizing Indigenous women even more? Well, if you want to get your child food, and your system of your economy, your culture, your ability to thrive has been taken away from you, you need to get to the city. There's no transportation system. You have to hitchhike to get your child food, right? And so that transportation system wasn't put into place. And I'll ask people again, when do you think that was put into place? Women started going missing from that highway in 1940. So that transportation system was put into place in 2018. There was not a cell service put into that area until 2022. A lot of people like Gladys Raddick, who's been fighting for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and family members for years, said that was the same time when the Coastal GasLink pipeline workers were in the area.
Yes, yeah.
Was it really for Indigenous communities? So these systems or these barriers, they're in a modern context, but they also have historical arms as well.
Yeah, and that's what's just so, well, for lack of a better word, frustrating, is that, if you look at the lack of transportation and all of the public services that we in the cities or we in settler colonial society enjoy just as, a matter of existing in this country. and how even that is not even a common occurrence in some of these areas. It's wild to me. But also, I wanted to touch on the police. And I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the police. You talk a lot about the police and how they have been instrumental, of course, if you talk about residential schools and kids being ripped from their families, all the way to bad data, for example. That whole data part that you have in there really irks me as an economist. But anyway, the fact is that the way the data is collected is questionable at best. And I want you to tell us how the police specifically, in their various ways, and just talk about how they have not only perpetuated the colonialization, but have continued to do so through abject failure after failure after failure. Because even in death, there is no justice. And that's what hit me, is that even in death, these families can't get closure. So I'm wondering if you could speak on that.
Yeah, I think it's an important part of our history to recognize that the RCMP were instrumental in, bringing children, many in droves on chicken trucks to residential school, right? They enforced that. If you were a mom and you wanted your kid back and made a fuss about it, you could go to jail. The kids who escaped could go to jail. They were brought back to residential school. That's how the RCMP started, right? It was to protect settler society. And in many ways, we see that system of violence continuing today, right? In terms of not just being a misunderstanding, but carrying out colonial policies, right? And so I think one of the things that I like to point to, there's a lot of people who say, where should I put my money when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? And I always say to the people who've been the police, to the people who've put up the missing posters, to the people who've been the investigators, to people who've been the private eyes, for people who've been the search and rescue, for people who've been the media, the family members, right? Who've not been afforded in many ways justice. There was a young woman in a community on Vancouver Island, and her body was found under pallets and garbage, and the police said it wasn't a suspicious death. She died from natural causes. And the family members had to push and push and push and say, that is not the case. We need this to be seen as a suspicious death. We need you to investigate this and find out what happened to our daughter. And journalists and Indigenous people, pushing and pushing on social media till finally the RCMP said, yes, we are investigating this as suspicious. But this was in 2023, right? These aren't historical cases. I think the media has moved the dial a lot when it comes to taking this matter seriously. And I see, in particular, a lot of young, white thing that I'm doing, but I really care. I want to see justice for these family members as well. But family members telling me the police aren't taking this seriously. There was one woman who the mom had to go on the yacht and try to find the DNA on her own. She didn't have money for a private eye. And the police saying, no, this was not suspicious. I hear that over and over and over and over again. The Vancouver police in British Columbia, handcuffed a 12-year-old girl and her grandfather for trying to open up a bank account, and to this day will not admit systemic racism in the force or that was racist at all, racial profiling. They just will not come to terms with that. And there was many opportunities in that instance, and I think it's really important to point out this to people. The Vancouver Police Department in that case was invited, they were actually forced by a human rights case to come to the Heiltsuk community in Bella Bella to witness the court of law in Heiltsuk law, which was in the big house, and to see how justice is carried out in their way. those officers who handcuffed didn't show up, right? And
Right.
by Celtic law, but also common sense, you can't have a stand-in for apologizing, right?
Yeah, their bosses tried to stand in,
Yeah.
I believe, yeah.
But, you know, if I like punched you out right now, I wouldn't send my boyfriend in to apologize, right?
No.
That's not how it works. And so, but there's opportunities for these institutions to learn and to see a better way forward, right? The Celtic said in that big house, they said, if we were in your court of law and we didn't show up for our court appearance, we would be sent to jail. How do you expect us to carry out our system of justice here? So I think it's important to see that there's not a lot of movement, and I know RCMP officers who are like me in the media who say this isn't working, and it's so hard to make change in these colonial institutions. It's so hard to shift cultures in those systems, no matter how hard or how many opportunities that are presented to them to create change.
But I feel like those institutions are just trying to undertake this diversity, equity, inclusion thing as another form of assimilation, if you know what I mean. So it's not about affording Indigenous practices equal footing. As equals.
No,
okay?
absolutely not.
It's
We're not even
absolutely
close
not.
to
It's
there
like,
yet.
it's like this performative thing. It's like when I was in school, they used to do like culture day, you know? And you bring in like your potluck, like little cultural dish. And then everybody tastes it, and then they call you the N-word the next day. You know, like I'm just, like to me, that's what it looks like. We've been going through this performative kind of, yes, everybody is equal, everybody is this, but when it comes to the actual practices, the procedures, all of these things, the actual gut of it, I just feel like people are too scared to even approach those things. And how do you get people to look past that? In other words, it's too difficult. You know what I mean? I just find that is, and maybe we're just in a period of just tired. We're just all tired, but can you answer that?
No.
I was
kidding.
struggling for the words. Can you speak on it?
I think one of the things that we did in like 2014 in colonial institutions was training, right? Training to teach people to address their unconscious bias, right? And people would watch these training videos at their desk and fast forward them, or while they're doing other things. And we've seen that, you know, in media, with the RCMP, with the police forces, with government employees, and that didn't work, right? I've spoken to a lot of people about what kind of training does work, right? And sometimes it works good in one-to-one to ask people, where is this coming from? But, you know, for me, I always ask this question. We're seeing right now a lot of racism in the healthcare system where it's actually killing Indigenous people. The last story that I did at CBC was an Indigenous youth who died strapped to a bed because they thought he was under the influence, where he had accidentally ingested windshield wiper fluid that he had a disability, and he thought it was an energy drink. That is very treatable. It's highly toxic, but it's treatable. They left him there to die. And so, you know, they are going through lots of training. They have been for years and years and years. And I said, where are the consequences? But
That's what's missing, isn't it?
Well, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the BC context anyways is anti-Indigenous racism, or racism period, isn't considered a harm within legislature, within law. It is now, for the first time in history, anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare is considered a harm. It's coming into effect maybe in 2024, right? And so you see things like that where it kind of tells you where we're at, right? But I do know that at my work, you'll read it in chapter 10 of my book, I talk a lot about a lot of the ways that I was treated, and there was one person who treated me extremely abusively, who was fired. people see that. People say, I can't have this behavior anymore, or there will be consequences. I'm not saying that's the only way to change culture, but if you don't have any consequences, it's like a child, right? You keep on bullying somebody and it's just considered okay, then the behavior is not going to change.
Yeah, it's normalized.
Great, yeah.
So where is media right now, do you think, in terms of the way they tell these stories? Like you said, they're more Indigenous stories, more Indigenous-centered stories. How are they doing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more Indigenous stories, you know, on TV, on websites. I think there's definitely an appetite for the public to learn about Indigenous stories. You know, we're seeing that over the last few days, right? But there's also a lot of polarization, right? There's a lot of reasons why I don't go on social media anymore, because there is a lot more hatred, right? We're seeing a lot of people not want to turn on TV, or, I mean, people don't use TVs that much anymore, but people not wanting to watch the news, to look at those stories anymore. Yeah, I think it's good to celebrate the good, right? I think there's more Indigenous stories. I think there's a lot of Indigenous people leaving media, like myself, because we're told constantly we don't belong. But I think we really do need that lens, right? We need a lens that is strength-based, right? When I left, I heard a lot of really disappointing questions being asked from Indigenous people that were not trauma-informed, that just focused on the trauma, that didn't focus on all the amazing things Indigenous people are doing, right? I use the example of the Tk'emlúps story that I did. I was the first mainstream media reporter that Cookbee Rosanna Casimir spoke to about the 215. I remember first hearing that story and seeing the nation was shocked, right? And I think Indigenous people are saying, well, why are you shocked? Because we've been hearing this for 100 years. We knew in 2015, as a whole, as a country, that Indigenous children died. The report stated, you know, there was at least 5,000 children, babies, children, teens that died, you know, whether it was from disease, whether it was from abuse, whether it was from fires, whether it was from neglect. We heard about that already. I always tell people, you have a right to be shocked. You have a right to be angry. You have a right to be emotional, because you are learning about this for the first time in history. It wasn't taught to me. My son is learning about this in school. He's 12, right, in elementary school. I went to school. We weren't taught anything about residential school. And so when I first started reporting on that story, I thought, for one, like, oh man, here we go again. And it was a lot of, and excuse me to say this word, but it was a lot of trauma porn, right?
Yep.
The way that people were telling the stories were just all this despair and the harshest stories that journalists could find. And, you know, we don't need to hear the worst story possible. We should just know from survivors' testimony that we've been hearing since 2015 how bad residential school was. What I wanted to tell, the stories that I wanted to tell when that communications person from Tk'emlúps talked to me, was that despite everything that they'd been through, Tk'emlúps people are actually using an annexed piece of that school to teach their community their language, to reclaim their connections with community, to talk about how to love again, to talk about retrieving their land back, to talk about reclaiming their culture, right? And through that lens, which is not taking away the losses of colonial violence, but focusing on looking forward, right? And looking at us as Indigenous people as multidimensional beings, rather as, you know, one dimension, which is just in our trauma.
Yeah.
And that is something that I really hoped that Unbroken could share with people. People often ask, well, why did you call it Unbroken? When I was a teenager, I was in lots of like Native youth activist groups, and I'd always hear the elders saying, they took everything away from us, but our spirit is not broken. As I was writing this book, I was like, our spirit is not broken, but our land is being reclaimed. Our connection is not broken. Our culture is not broken. Our language is not broken. We are not broken. We are not just still here. We are reclaiming a path forward. And so I think that's, something that people always ask me, and something that I think is important to put out there, to see Indigenous people as more than just trauma.
I got it. when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, It reminded me, there's this, does anybody know the Japanese art of putting together broken things with what's it called? Yes, or platinum, or yeah. Anyway, it creates, it takes something broken and it creates something better when you start healing the cracks with spirit, with identity, with community. Like, that's what I think the gold is, in other words, and things like that. So when when I saw Unbroken, that's what I thought of. Yeah. Do we have time for questions? We do? Am I too? Okay. Questions?
As a white French Canadian, what can I do to... I get emotional because I can't... I know it's not just trauma, you were saying. Mm-hmm. And I worked for an Aboriginal organization, and I was in awe at the spirituality and the community. It was beautiful. It was the best experience I've ever had. And I didn't know about residential schools till I worked there. And it was hard. But what can I do as a Canadian to support? And other than educate my children, which I did. The minute I thought, you guys need to know about this. This is not right. But what else can I do?
So one of the things that I wished people would have done when I was in a mainstream news outlet, like an institution, just like any other. Jody Wilson-Raybould and I related so much about her experience in government and my experience in media, being the only one, always seen kind of as a threat, always, being the only one to speak out. My desire for settler Canadians, for white people, which I am, my mom's white, my dad also has white in him, I'm mostly white. Often I was the only one speaking out because I was like, I have power, I have privilege, I need to speak out, but I was always the only one. How I would have wished in so many circumstances that I was in, that someone, right, one of those 5 white women around the table, or 10, would have said, this is wrong, this is inappropriate behavior, this is a good story, you belong, you matter, this story is important. Not once. I was always the only one, and it sucked, and it's the reason I left. Speak out, say something. I think people get caught up in like, oh, am I taking their power away? Am I taking their voice away? I was in a prison. It was the first stop on my book tour in the Fraser Valley, and I was with all these women who were all inmates, and they were saying really inappropriate things, and I didn't know what to do. But the woman who was running the book club, she was a white woman. So one of the women, one of the inmates said, well, and trigger warning, she said, I don't think it should be Black Lives Matter, I think it should be all lives matter. And I just was in shock, and sometimes it like hurts, right? And I'm just like feeling the emotions. And the white woman said, that is absolutely wrong, corrected her, told her why it was wrong, and educated her, and used that moment to, to use her calm nervous system, to use her white privilege to set that inaccuracy right. I wish there were more people in the world like that. And when I'm talking about the healthcare system, that last story that I did, how many Indigenous people were harmed or have been harmed in that system? One of the biggest things that the people who are trying to make changes in that system have talked about among nurses is speak out culture, normalizing speak out culture. We get in trouble for speaking out. We're told not to speak out. We're told not to speak the truth. That is the one thing you can do. On top of that, right now on the internet, there are 5,000 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's National Inquiry, from the Helen Osborne report, and from the many other reports that Indigenous people have put out, right? Fight for us, use your voice, use your gift. Everyone has your gift. I'm really shy. I don't like to speak out, I hate it. But I know that it's a gift that I have, right? When I was living on the street, I had nothing. I had my sleeping bag, I had nowhere to go, I didn't have friends, I didn't have family, but I had a pen. And I used that pen to fight for people. And everyone has that gift. Use that to fight for people who might not have as much privilege and power as you do. That's a great question.
Can I add something?
Thank you.
Can I add something? I think it's really important to be a witness for somebody. I think it's really what our institutions do is they isolate people who do speak out. And they isolate them so that they can be picked off. If nobody says anything, then nobody says anything. And sometimes you're out there on a limb saying the truth, knowing that it's the truth. And it's only a year later that people are like, oh yeah, you said that. You need to be a witness for people. You need to use your voice. Because I'm telling you, this work is, how do you do self-care actually? How do you take care of yourself? I mean, think of it.
Well, are there any more questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead. That's kind of I love engagement with the audience. I love it because I see where people are at, and I like to offer.
Hello. I am a journalist as well. I worked in Northern Ontario for a few years, and I was telling a story about systemic racism in a Northern Ontario city, and one of the people I spoke with was a deputy grand chief who told me a story about how his wife was left at a emergency room, and she almost died. You know, she almost bled out, and you know they weren't really taking care of her. And ultimately, in a story about systemic racism in the city, my editors decided that this was not a story to include. And it was experiences like that that really I had to pull away for a bit in journalism. I'm doing freelance, but do you have any faith in media, just given the weight against this kind of storytelling, that to be done in a meaningful way that isn't just platitudinal?
Yeah, I do. I do have faith. That Maxwell Johnson story that I told that made international headlines immediately when I told it. It told me that Canadians wanted to learn about racism. They wanted to hear it. They wanted to feel it. It empowered Indigenous people. It made us feel validated because this story was not uncommon. The first time I pitched that story, the producer said, "It's a really important story, Angela, but it's too complicated, so we'll leave it for now." But I knew that there was somebody else who would pick it up, right? And my producer at the time, Catherine Ralston, a white woman, was like, absolutely done, we're doing it immediately. All platforms, TV, radio, and gave me all the resources I needed to tell that story, and people were on, right? And I have a lot of faith. I have a lot of faith, like you were saying about Gen Z. I don't know if you're Gen Z, but I know a lot of my, yeah. A lot of my students were so brilliant when I was teaching, like a lot of the 20-year-olds, but they were like, my friends are not at the same place that I'm at. So that gave me like not a lot of hope. But there are people in my newsroom who are like, we need to do better. It sucks to see so many Indigenous people leaving, and people like you who are telling those good stories, but I told freelance stories for the first like 5 years of my career, and I think I loved it. And so I think just keep on pushing to tell those stories and use your voice and use your power and privilege, right? I do have faith.
Hello. So a little context is needed. I'm an EDI specialist. I know the jokes are good. And I'm somewhat young in my career, and my question for you is, how are you surviving these spaces? Because I'm struggling, and it's very hard. Usually I am the only Black person or person of color in the room, and it's very hard to do that work when you're the only one who's racialized doing that work, and having other people try to speak for other communities that they don't fully understand. So how did you survive?
I didn't, right? I mean, not only that, but when that's the thing is I have young journalists, women of color, who are Gen Zs, who are coming up to me and like, can you train me? Can I be your mentor? Like, I want to be like you. And I'm like, no, you do not, right? My adrenaline was just soaring. That's how I survived. I was just always feeding off the negativity and the desire to fight, right? I had to be on all the time and loving it. I had to love the fight in order to keep on going. Not only was I, fighting for justice with the stories, but then I was fighting all the people in the newsroom who were saying, it's not an important story, or this is the way you should tell it in a more diluted way. My nervous system was wrecked the whole time. And to be honest, when I started kind of noticing where I was at and working on meditation, sometimes 2 hours a day in that environment, mindfulness, rewiring my brain, calming my nervous system in healthy ways. When I started to do that, I think my body was just like, you just cannot do this. And I had, at the end, the most supportive, loving team. My direct producer was a woman of color who was also like, we will not let racism get through in this environment for you, because that I was fighting my colleagues, people who were constantly, I'd won the most awards, in the newsroom, and people were like, does Angela really know what she's doing with this story? That was 2023. And that producer saying, get the hell out of here, do not mess with Angela, right? But even in that environment, I was wrecked. It destroyed my nervous system. So, I feel like my advice to you is be in an environment where you belong, where you feel loved, where you feel supported, where you feel honored, because you deserve it. You don't deserve to be in an environment like that, no matter how important it feels. I don't regret doing what I did, because I feel like I made changes alongside many. But at CBC, we would have groups of 30 people of color who were fighting the good fight and taking it to the white bosses, and they were just like, cute, but no. They were literally like, yeah, but no. And we were all of us left. If you look at the people, I won't say his name, but there's an Ottawa host, he was right there beside me, and we just can't anymore. And I don't regret what I did at all. I'm so glad I did it. As a journalist, fighting that fight, but it was hard being the only one. And now I just want to be around my own people, right? And just not having to, Indigenous explain everything, just people getting it, right? Or this audience laughing at my jokes, or, that would be my advice to you. I know it might not be the advice you wanted, but.
I, as many, am very touched by what you said. So I could just sit down here and cry, but I didn't think that would make a difference. I'll give you a little bit of a preamble to the story. I'll make it short. In 2016, I wanted to do something for the sesquicentennial, and I quickly realized that I couldn't do anything without educating myself on the Indigenous worldview. Serendipitously, somebody introduced me to the Cumic Lodge, and I went there from 2016 to 2020 religiously. I met with elders that touched my soul. I'm passionate about intergenerational opportunities. Which generation do you think we could work with that will have the biggest impact? So what I mean, if I have 10 hours to spend, what I do is I spend it with young children. So when I wear my Indigenous tie and I go into a school of grade 3s and the guy says, Mr. Georgopoulos, are you Anishinaabe? I've made a difference. So I'm biased here telling you, working with the younger generation, but which generation do you think we could make the biggest difference?
I think all of them. You know, in our feast hall, we honor all the generations, right? We honor the elders. In our language, we call the children the majagali, the delicate little flowers, right? They're the most precious ones. But we honor everybody. Everybody in our feast hall has a place, right? And I think, you know, I love my son, he's 12. Like, he teaches me, Mom, there's 78 genders, right? And I'm like, oh God, I feel so old school. You know, and I'm like, oh my God, you're so amazing, you know? And the young ones, the 20-year-olds, I'm just in awe of the things that they not tolerating toxic masculinity, for example, in the way that my generation did. But we need to work as a community. You know, we can't work separately, like just this generation or just this generation. We need to work all together and honor all the generations.
Thank you.
Wait, before you go, may I ask why you specifically asked about the gender?
Okay, so.
Is this the part you don't want to?
Oh, no, the part here is, if somebody says something that I know is dead wrong, am I going to spend my energy trying to educate somebody? The mileage I'm going to get with the grade 3, 4s, and 5s, if I spend that 5 hours with them, I'm going to get further ahead than explaining it to somebody who says totally unforgivable remarks. So I've gone upstream all the time. And now at this mature age of almost 70, I will take a chance and speak up more. When I spoke up years ago, I lost jobs and I lost promotions. And I've lived in enough cities, et cetera, so you know what I'm talking about. So I've been there, and I'm a white guy with white hair. So I could see that. So right now, I guess I respect that all generations should be respected, but I think if we start at a young age, they're going to have the voices, and I'll get much more mileage out of my 5 or 10 or 20 hours that I spend with younger people. I'll certainly respect the older people, but some minds can't be changed. They're too set in their ways.
Thank you so much for sharing. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, thank you. First, I'll just comment on the last one. I appreciate your opinion. I clearly am a 30-ish-year-old person, and so I can say in my experience, when I'm communicating with people who are like my grandparents or a little bit older, I'm usually pretty comfortable sharing my things that I learned with them, because I think someone's never too old to unlearn things, you know? Like, yes, they're gonna have a different opinion and perspective, but I think it's worth still working with all generations, like you said, and maybe because I'm with usually older people, that's my perspective on that last comment. But my question, first and foremost.
I have a question, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much for writing your book, but I am so sorry for the things that you had to go through to write that book, and to the people and the families and the friends and the communities that had to go through all of those things to write that book. So of course your book weaved together your story, but also the story of many other people, and you had to speak with many of those families and friends, and you acknowledged that you were aware that in doing so, you didn't want to re-traumatize them. I just want to say that from my perspective, you know, it can't be my decision to decide what was worth that, but your book was incredibly impactful, incredible to read, and that I hope that those families take peace in the way that you did that. Can you tell me more about your experience communicating with those families, talking to them, how you kept track of, I'm sure, all the notes, especially with your comments of how poorly note-taking was done by other authorities?
Yeah.
So just anything on that?
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's a really great question on the, I think, it sounds like you've read the book, because the note-taking part is a big part of the book. But yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question. One of the things that I went to Banff with some incredible writers, so Wabagijik Rice, Cherie Demeline, Alicia Elliott, and Joseph Boyden. We didn't know then what we know now, but I didn't have a choice, by the way, to go. He was one of our teachers, and we actually had to confront him. But one of the things that we confronted him, or that I confronted him on, was, where did you get consent to tell these stories from? And he just sort of said, well, I feel like the characters are talking to me. And I said, so you've manufactured that consent. for me, it was incredibly important to have consent from the family members. I honored them with gifts as well, to honor them for their time. For Vanessa Hands, that's Lavina Moody's daughter, man, we spoke hours at a time for over 7 years. All the time we were talking, and she would ask me, like, why are you so passionate about this? Allowing people, do you want to ask me anything as well? And taking down some of those, I guess, like narratives that the journalist is the authority and we're going to tell your story, and letting them tell me how to tell their story. And I think that's what I was kind of doing at the end of my career, and I was telling my bosses that, like, this is going to be strength-based, that they want it to be strength-based. And they said, well, they don't get to tell it. And I said, why? This is their story, not mine. I'm going to tell it through that lens. And keeping in contact with them after the book was published as well. Are you okay? How are you doing? I mean, if you've read the book, you'll know that probably things got very unsafe for Vanessa Hands at the end. And that was scary, really scary for me. And constantly being like, oh my God, is this okay? And not publishing stuff to protect her. So that relationship was extremely important to me, and very different than the way I was told to do my job as a mainstream news journalist, but incredibly important question.
Hi, Angela. I want to start by saying thank you for being here. My name's Callie. I'm currently at Algonquin College, the public relations program. I've recently been given the task of advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, to try and win a campaign. And my question is, what can I do in the city, in the capital city, to amplify their stories and their voices without feeling like I'm taking over their voices?
I think it's good to take direction from family members, right? And ask, like, how can I assist, right? How can I take some of that weight off you? I just see family members struggling. Like, there's a lot of like amazing spokespeople that I know who are also family members, but they've taken it on as their duty and are kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak, and they're exhausted. And there's a lot of family members who just can't. They can't speak out. They're grieving. They're fighting for justice. But I think taking direction from them in terms of what they need. Do you need me to amplify this? Do you need me to use your voice? Do you need me to write this press release for you?
Okay, back to consent.
Yeah, yeah, but good for you, because we need more people like you taking that on.
Thank you.
As a mixed person myself, I would say, depending on the day I'm passing or not, was there any way you kind of grappled with your identity in the workplace and like being seen as who you are or being seen as Indigenous?
Yeah. That's an interesting question, though. I remember when I first got my first job at a radio station, Co-op Radio, and the guy is actually now a known CBC reporter in Toronto, and I reached out to him being like, do you remember this? But he, so it was a program for people of color, and they named, like, we used Native back then, or maybe it was Aboriginal. So it was about Latin American and Canadian development issues, and so we really focused on poverty in Indigenous communities on the Canadian side. And when I went in for the interview, he said, how do you relate to being Indigenous? And it was a white man asking me this. And I was just like, I was a teenager, right? I didn't know. I grew up, my identity was very politicized, right? We were fighting the largest Aboriginal rights and title case of the time, the Delgamuukw. So everything was about fighting for our land. But I know what he was wanting. He wanted to hear me kind of like, oh, I drum and I sing, or that kind of thing, right? And I was just like, I don't know. And I was just like, I have a status card. Like, I just didn't know. And he was so disappointed in my answer, and I'm surprised I got the job. But I reached out to him, and I asked him if he remembered. It was weird. I was writing it in the book, and I was like, oh, that's that guy. It was really interesting. But I think, you know, in the workspace, I see people who are incredibly successful who don't talk about being Indigenous at all, right? They're doing all, they're, you know, covering the Queen and the King, and they don't, and they actually say, I don't want to be the Indigenous reporter. I just want to do my job. And I say, hell yeah, like do you, right? But I see those people a lot more successful, a lot faster than if you're fighting to tell the stories of your own people. You're sort of constantly called bias, right? Even though all the people at City Hall are white and none of the white reporters are called bias for covering them. I even actually saw a reporter the other day, I won't say it because people will know who I'm talking about, but I was just like, damn. I was like, I could never do that. I mean, they were taking a selfie with a minister and posting it on social, being like, this is my date. And I was like, oh man, I'd get probably fired for that. I'd get called into the office for sure. It would be a huge deal. And I was just like, there's different systems for different people in 2023. And that needs to change, and that's why I think white people, I'm speaking on my white half, my white heritage, we need to speak out more. We need to make more space, and sometimes that means speaking out about injustices you see all around you that might seem benign, but that are very powerful sources of telling people that white supremacy is still here.
Hi, good evening. This is more a comment in addition to elaborate a little bit on what you've said, and actually a little bit as well for what the question the gentleman asked. It's very important, I think, yes, to speak up, but I think what's physically, tangibly more important is to write to our elected officials. People don't vote, and then when they do vote, they don't ever put in writing anything. All the frustrations, let's say, about COVID, like a totally different subject, they were misdirected. Everything was on social media instead of being said. It takes less amount of time to write to the Prime Minister's office or to your MP or to your MPP about literally anything than it takes for you to make a picture look good and for you to write this very heartfelt thing on social media and to express all of your thoughts. So I would like to remind everybody in this room to please write to your public officials and question, and I've been in sales for a very long time. They always tell us to focus, it's called the 20-80 rule, because you focus on your 20 top performers because they are the ones that are affluent. They are the ones that the 80% are going after and saying, hey, can you be my mentor? Can you help me? Can you show me why you're successful? And so if someone has very limited amount of time, if I can only volunteer for 30 minutes and an hour and whatever per week or several hours, then I would definitely spend it on people who have more influence. And whether we like it or not, it's the baby boomers. That is the largest number of population, like in terms of population, right? So we do need to speak to the baby boomers because they are affecting their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So these are the two things I wanted to share, and I hope that they are helpful. And thank you very much for writing the book. I am buying it now, and I'm going to be reading it before the end of the week.
Thank you. And might I just say, keep on speaking out on social media because that changed my career. Any ways that you can make change is a good one. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Angela, so much. Thank you all for being here. The bookstore is right there. Let's give Angela some carpal tunnel syndrome. She's got an injured hand already, so if we all buy 6 or 7 books, she'll remember this night forever. I hope to see everyone tomorrow for Naomi Klein. And next week it's Ed Broadbent, Kathy Reichs, the Booker Prize shortlist, and the City of Ottawa Book Awards, and then it's the Writers' Festival. So see you soon. Yeah.